Our last video focused on the first two questions that you need to answer when you read any case: what court issued its opinion and why, and the procedural history of how we got to this opinion. Now I'm going to focus on what's actually even more crucial when reading cases. First, I'm going to focus on the holding and then the rationale for the holding. The holding is simply the law that the case makes. And we think about case law as being actually creating law itself. And it's kind of interesting. In this course, we've got the law of the federal rules. That itself is law. But then when courts make decisions based on their interpretation of the federal rule, those judicial decisions are also law. And so we have to read cases and to figure out what that holding is. And it's not always intuitively obvious what that holding is. Sometimes it takes a fair amount of work to figure out exactly what the court is saying the law is. And our goal, when we're thinking about what the law is to focus on being able to articulate the holding and how this law will apply to cases with different facts. Because it's unlikely this exact same case is going to arise again. And for purposes of our class, you need to focus on the procedural holding, the civil procedure holding, not the substantive holding. So this case does say something about the Railway Act and what it means to discriminate under that federal statute. But this isn't this is not a course on discrimination law. It's instead a course in civil procedure. So we want to focus on the civil procedure holding, a holding that will be applicable in cases that don't involve discrimination. They may involve antitrust or environmental law, completely different types of claims. So in this particular case, looking for the holding is actually somewhat easy, because the court very expressly says, "We hold." They're not always going to come out and be that easy in terms of identifying the holding for you. But when they do say, "We hold something," well, then what follows that phrase is the holding of the case. So you want to read this information here really, really, really carefully. Here there are, in fact, two holdings represented by these two paragraphs. In the first paragraph, the court is focusing on what's called substantive sufficiency of the complaint. And we can identify this because the court's talking about the substantive law that underlies the plaintiff's claims. The general principles laid down in Steele, and Steele is the case that they referred to way back at the beginning of their opinion, Steele versus Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which talk about the Railway Labor Act and what discrimination means, and the fact that unions have to represent all the employees in their collective bargaining unit, not just the white employees. And so the court's saying this complaint is sufficient under Steele, that the claim it sets out has basis in the substantive law. The Railway Act prohibits unions from engaging in race discrimination. Now that's a holding that's pretty narrow, because it's only dealing with the Railway Act, and so it's not going to be very useful except in circumstances when the Railway Act arises again. So let's keep reading and see if we can find information that will be useful for cases that don't necessarily involve the Railway Act. The next sentence, the court talks about, in appraising the sufficiency of the complaint, we follow the accepted rule: complaint should not be dismissed for failure to state a claim unless it appears beyond doubt that the plaintiff can prove no set of facts in support of his claim which would entitle him to relief. That is a statement of the holding that would apply even if we're talking about a different source of law, even if it's not a Railway Act claim, even if it's an antitrust claim or an environmental claim. That statement sounds useful. Complaint should not be dismissed for failure to state a claim unless it appears beyond doubt that the plaintiff can prove no set of facts in support of his claim which would entitle him to relief. That is the substantive sufficiency holding of this case. Next, the court talks about the defendant's additional argument related to the sufficiency of the complaint, saying in addition to arguing that claims don't have a basis in substantive law, the defendants also argue that the complaint failed to set forth specific facts to support the allegations of discrimination. And here the court says the federal rules of civil procedure do not require a claimant to set out in detail the facts on which he bases his claim. And they cite the federal rule here that we've read. To the contrary, the court says all the rules require is a short and plain statement of the claim. And they also point to the illustrative forms in the rules, saying that we're talking about notice pleading here, we're talking about something that's going to be relatively easy. It doesn't have to be a lot of detail in the complaint. You can look at the rationale underlying this part of the court's holding. They give several reasons, looking at the forms, looking at the text of the rule itself. They also look at another rule, Rule 8F, and the general philosophy of notice pleading, and also a policy argument that we don't want pleading to be a game of skill in which one misstep may be decisive to the outcome. So I highlight these rationale to highlight, in addition to actually articulating the holding, I need you to also focus on the rationale for the holding. What reasons does the court give for setting out this particular standard for pleading? Okay, so there are two holdings here. A substantive holding, substantive sufficiency of the complaint, saying Rule 8A requires that there be a basis in substantive law. And then also there's a formal sufficiency requirement of pleading, that there's enough detail in the complaint. But the court says actually there doesn't have to be nearly as much detail as the defendants think, because we have this philosophy of notice pleading. The rules suggest that it's not that onerous, and the court gives several reasons in support of that rationale. You notice I'm talking about substantive and formal sufficiency. Those terms don't appear in the case itself. Those are terms that appear in the notes to help us understand this case better. And that's a framework that you'll often see the casebook using, as you may not see these labels in the case itself, but they're tools for understanding what the case is doing. All right. So remember, 4 questions whenever you read a case. What court issued the opinion and when, to help us know whether the case is authoritative, the procedural history, the holding, and the rationale for the holding.